Thank you. Great to be here and to be with you all and to hear these presentations. And I want to talk a little bit about transitioning into adulthood. And if I may start with a billboard that I saw in my community some time ago in Edmonton. I don't know if others may have seen this, but it says, "See the ability, meet Nicholas." So here's Nicholas. He has a girlfriend, a great career, and loves his life. He also has Down syndrome. And this is a billboard that speaks to the pathway to adulthood, which is what I want to speak about for a few minutes, and what we often call transition. But on my initial slide, as you saw, we face many transitions in our lives, but I want to talk about the transition into adulthood, which is often a big shift in terms of the service system, and what is available in our communities, but also some key points of change. So here's some key points of change. So there is certainly system and organization-based shifts. So someone may shift from a service delivery system of FSCD to PDD, for instance, speaking of all the acronyms in our area. They may move in terms of development, so physical, cognitive, emotional development and changes, social maturation and skill development. As we move into adulthood, and there was a question earlier in a presentation about vocation and post-secondary education, so choice and planning, sexual identity, romantic relationships, so relationships often beyond our family of origin, quality of life. So thinking about what does participation in the community mean, and meaning-making, life choices, thinking in terms of where to live or what is a value in moving forward into adulthood. And then there are multiple complex intersections. We don't live our life in one area. So the area of education, but also community, and integrating, thinking about the individual in the context of the family and the community, and what that means in terms of resources that might have policy implications, finding funding. So there are many things to think about. Now back to Nicholas. So the things that Nicholas is identified for here are issues of adulthood. So he has a girlfriend, so relationships beyond his family of origin, a great career, so job, vocation, and importantly, loves his life. He loves his life. And I think that is a marker of transition. Now, I want to just speak for a moment around what we often think about in transition. And I want to say that some of the thinking around what makes for a successful transition often come from a very neurotypical orientation. And I think that notion about Nicholas and what matters to him, he loves his life, is an important marker we need to think about. Because when we look at what we often consider in transition, look at them here: acquisition of independence, so future-oriented, self-determined, self-reflective, indeed important, but that downplays the importance of interdependence and what that means in terms of somebody living and thriving in their community. Not to diminish that there's agency and choice, but think about what matters to that individual. Another marker that we often talk about is relational maturity, responsibility, reliability, future orientation, and independence or agency in acting and thinking. And I think that we need to really think deeply about transition on what matters to the individual and what is within their realm of possibility. I want to speak a little bit to some of the transitional outcomes in autism. So here's some of the numbers, and there was a question about post-secondary education earlier. Some earlier stats, and these are somewhat dated, but less than 50% of individuals with autism were in post-secondary education beyond high school, 2 years post-high school, and 5 to 40% completed post-secondary education, So those numbers are strikingly low. So it speaks to um, low numbers and some challenges in our post-secondary education system. So, and some of those issues that we are bringing attention to, and I trust there's some shifts happening in post-secondary education. A lack of structure, heavy coursework demands, and a loss of social supports. And those are some of the areas that post-secondary settings are working on in terms of developing support. So thinking about what are the needs of the young person in your life in terms of supports to succeed in post-secondary education, and working with disability services within that institution to find those resources are so critical. Now, what are some markers that ease the path as people move towards transition? And I wanted to speak to some that are in the literature. First of all, the literature speaks to when there are fewer additional or coexisting challenges like mental health or health issues, that makes the path easier. Now, remember, that just makes the path easier potentially. That doesn't mean that we can't circumvent or manage that. One of the markers that the literature speaks about easing the path is early speech development, adaptive behavior, being able to regulate and navigate challenging moments or contexts, increase social skills and employment experience. Now, we can moderate that by providing those experiences earlier on, like in high school, family support, parent education, and expectations around some of the markers for that pathway to adulthood. So setting those expectations. Socioeconomic status was linked to the likelihood of moving forward in some of those areas of post-secondary education and employment. And finally, motivation. So what motivates that individual to engage in areas like employment or further education? We've been involved in a study, and I'll briefly talk about that, looking at the experiences of transition to adulthood, things that support the facilitators and the barriers to accessing services in transition. And we interviewed autistic youth and young adults, parents, and service providers. And here's what we found. Transition required supports and resources. It took support in the area of education, disability services, employment support, health and mental health care resources. And fortunately, there are a growing volume of resources. So I think about in our own city, wonderful resources, groups like Autism Edmonton, that some of the resources there, and others in our communities. Think about what is in your community in terms of support. I'm going to speak about some of these resources in a few minutes. There were, however, limitations within and across systems, and I suspect that will be no surprise to those in the audience. There are challenges, but the supports buffer some of the barriers. But certainly there's capacity building needed in the area of transitions and resources for adults. Now, this picture, I hesitated to put this on, but it really says what binds us. What are the unhelpful attitudes and responses that can get in the way in supporting individuals and families to find their pathway in adulthood? And here are some that our participants spoke about. A lack of nuanced understanding of autism within the transitional services, particularly those that are more generic. Insufficient recognition of autism amongst its diversities and related challenges. So where someone or a resource focused on autism but not on mental health challenges, or vice versa, or didn't address some of the sensory challenges that an individual faced. And another barrier was an overfocus on a deficit-oriented approach to thinking about developmental disability, rather than the vista of how our communities are richer for the engagement of the diversity that includes autism. And people talked about insufficient service availability, the lack of accountability for what was offered or what was claimed to be offered, or not following up on individualized goals. So it's one thing to set transitional goals. It's another thing to resource those so someone can actually move forward in that pathway. And some of the resources, there was rigidity in terms of access restrictions and insufficient availability, high wait times, inaccessibility, and short service duration, which I think is an important issue. If we think, for instance, of employment supports, that may mean someone being involved over time and not for a very limited duration that is insufficient to lead to not just someone getting a job, but keeping a job and moving forward in that job to ongoing career success. So some things to consider. Resources to plan and prepare for the future. And this picture is a young picture, and it's somewhat intentional to say, let's think about this early in terms of how to transition. We live most of our lives in adulthood. What does that mean? What would render success for the young person in your life? What matters to them? What matters to your family? Find educational opportunities for families and service providers, and there are a growing number of those resources. And I want to talk about a few, but one place I would start is contacting Autism Edmonton, that offers many resources, and that's just a great local resource. Peer engagement and mentorship emerged in our work as really critical. Connecting with other parents. So I just applaud you all for being here and learning, but also being amongst one another and finding resources. And as a parent, some of the resources that I have valued the most, I learned from other parents. And so that engagement and mentorship. Collaborative partnerships across sectors. And I think this is really about our systems working together well, realizing that autism impacts a multiplicity of areas. So how do we work in the post-secondary education, the employment sector, in the funding sector in terms of disability services, in areas of guardianship or trusteeship? There are multiple areas to consider. So how do we bring those together? Happy to talk more about that. And consider when and how to talk to your youth about transition and plan with them about that. And I think that will be particular to families and family values. But I would say the time probably to start isn't at age 18. It's probably moving back earlier than that, thinking about some of those early years. How do we prepare well? An example of that is, are there employment options or internship options in high school? And we think about that with other youth. We need to think about that with our autistic youth and provide those opportunities for them to thrive in community. And so the question becomes, how might you motivate the youth in your life to engage in areas of interest, of areas that are of value, that may be linked possibly to vocation and transitional activities? And sometimes that takes some ingenuity to think about what are the areas that would link well to areas of vocation. So what to consider? Some areas, these are broad-based areas just that have emerged and examples of others, but what are the goals? What are the dreams? What are the hopes of the youth in your life, or the adults, and your family? Key supporters in your network. And this has multiple facets. This may be key people, friends, others, peers. It might be people across the lifespan that care deeply and that are involved in the life of your youth, or the young adult in your life, and people that are well connected and care deeply for that individual and become integral to that life path, that network of support. Financial management, thinking about the sustainability of that. And as parents are less involved over the years, many years ahead, what does that mean in terms of financial management? That's a long-term thought piece to work through, social skills, behavioral supports, guardianship, trusteeship as relevant, may or may not be relevant in your situation. Housing, what does that look like as we think about those possibilities and challenges? Peer support engagement, and there are more and more opportunities that I see in our community for peer support and engagement. Post-secondary education, the question came up earlier, what about a diagnosis? And I think with children and with adults, diagnosis becomes a pathway to services. And I think that is the case in post-secondary education. Finding those services in some of those disability services in post-secondary education, and thinking about the breadth. So it could be trade schools, it could be colleges, it could be universities. I just met the other day with folks at Northwest College, and they've got some really interesting programming. So think about the possibilities that are out there. And some people may rather look for paths related to employment. And I've added career. So think about career entails what matters and a long-term path of sustainability for that individual. So what matters to them? What are areas of generativity and interest and passion and growth? So this leads me to, I'm almost done here, but thinking about transition, not so much as independence, which has often it's talked about, but rather QOL, and QOL stands for quality of life. Or what one autistic person said, he said, Dave, you've got it all wrong. You add all these jargon. It means a good life on my terms. And I thought that's a good way to say it. A good life on my terms as the essential marker of moving forward well. And these folks, Raphael and colleagues, talked about a theory of that. And their theory was being who you want to be, belonging, so the environment fits for who that person is and wants to be, and where they want to thrive, what our community means and can mean to us all, and becoming, so the pursuit of aims that matter to the individual, the degree to which a person enjoys the possibilities of his or her life. Few resources, and amongst many. One here, I've spoken about Autism Edmonton, and I would invite, I see the executive director on the call from Autism Edmonton, and that would be a great place to start. But also some of our service providers in the city have really important resources and would be worth exploring. But here's a few in the country. So Aid Canada, and I have circled Aid Canada, and the site that is there. This is a repository of resources on key topics that matter. In this case, it's transition to adult services. There are webinars, there are educational toolkits. This is a toolkit. So that is one resource. Another one that I find quite helpful is on Family Support Institute of BC. So this is called Find Support BC Transitions Timeline, and you can plug in ages and developmental issues and come up with a developmental plan strategy. So this is a really interesting resource, and the Family Support Institute of BC is a terrific resource from our colleagues further west of us. Finally, this is a new resource here in Alberta. It's located at the Alberta Caregiver College that is associated with Alberta Health Services and the Glenrose. And this is a busy slide, and I just want to bring it to your attention. If you Google Alberta Caregiver College, you can find this. And on this site, I've circled here, there is a transition planning module that is training particularly for navigators, but I think it has relevance to parents as you plan transition to adulthood. And there's other ones here. The next one to the right is Pathways of Support. And one of our speakers today, Dr. Sandy Thompson-Hodgetts, is presenting there. On all of these, there's a parent presentation as well. So they become important resources. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention to this. I invite any comments or questions.